So we'll close our unit on the Mexican-American War today, and we saw last time that some of the beginning causes of this war. Remember that the Mexican-American War itself took place between 1846 and 1848. The reason, territorial expansion, and as we saw last time, really the living into this notion of manifest destiny that had really taken control of the minds and hearts of Americans, Anglo-Americans especially. Um, but Texas was annexed to the Union well before that, in 1845. And this is something that we want to look at, right? And before that, even, James Polk ran for president in 1844, largely on a commitment to a kind of providential territorial expansion, a westward momentum that hadn't yet been called manifest destiny, but did understand itself in cosmic and mythic terms. And the voters liked that. Polk, slave-holding anti-abolitionist, promised the immediate annexation of Texas, which the previous president, the outgoing President Tyler, had already called for, and also the immediate expansion into and control over the entirety of the West, right, including California, all of the Oregon Territory or Oregon Country, which is present-day Oregon, Idaho, Washington, a lot of British Columbia. Oregon Territory was British-controlled at this point, so what Polk promised was to get them to sign off on just giving the land to the Anglo-Americans, the new Americans, right? His campaign slogan, 54-40 or fight, meant that America would control all land up to that latitudinal line. The bottom right of the screen, you can see where 54-40 is. That's the top latitudinal line. 49, which is the middle one, is actually where the ceding of land happened. It was kind of a midpoint between what the Brits claimed and what the Anglo-Americans claimed. They settled on that 49th parallel in June of 1846, willing to compromise, really because Americans were not interested in another war front. Now, we're focused on the southern lands, and we'll get right back there, but I do want to mention that the northern lands were active. This was the era of the Oregon Trail, which folks of my generation knew as the very first video game, and apparently you can still access this video game for free online. It looks much different than it did. The upper icon is closer to what it looks like now. The bottom icon is what it looked like when children of the 80s learned about the Oregon Trail through the only video game most of us had ever seen. But there was a lot of westward movement in this direction. We're going to kind of set it aside because the 54-40 or fight never led to fighting, and it didn't lead to the 54-40. And it, other than participating in a kind of frontiersmanship, manifest destiny, it doesn't do anything separate from the Mexican-American War to build a mythos into America in a way that the Mexican-American War does. So I just want to note it here that yes, the Oregon Trail was happening. This is part of that, what many young Americans in the public school system learn as part of the American heritage of a self-determined, ruggedly individualistic frontiersmanship that has really been built into American identity. This was happening at the same time and participated in a lot of the same. It was Polk. It was President Polk who did all of this. But let's return to the Mexican-American War, the southern border of Mexico, which is where we're at. They, 54-40 or fight, nobody was going to fight because, again, they had just declared war upon Mexico and nobody was interested in, and nobody could really afford to, in terms of money or people, to have another war front, right? War was declared on Mexico in May of 1846, and we see some of the broadsheets that came out at that time urging men to join the army, to arms, go volunteer to war against Mexico, New England to the rescue, right? By the time John O'Sullivan named Manifest Destiny, which we see again that quote in the bottom right, our manifest destiny is to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions. I might just note, if I haven't already, as an aside, that at the time of Manifest Destiny's sort of cultural invention or naming, at the time of this quote, our yearly multiplying millions were very much multiplying through immigration. That was built into the notion of how Anglo-American colonial America would people these lands. Anyway, by the time John O'Sullivan named Manifest Destiny, the concept was already really active within the American consciousness, within the American psyche. It had come to define a good portion of the American political scene. O'Sullivan just gave it a name that stuck and kind of became, famous through that, a name that resonated with the well-established American cultural inclination to a language of statecraft that is what Andrew Bacevich, military historian, really, really great, we'll turn to him later, in the words of Andrew Bacevich, this language of statecraft is, and since the beginning has been, bold, ambitious, and confident. It's just, it's providential, it's in cosmic terms. Manifest Destiny fit with that American inclination. So Polk won the presidency by a razor-thin margin, just over 30,000 votes. His election heralded, for many U.S. historians, the beginning of a mature two-party system, something that, remember, Washington, the nation's first president, had cautioned against strongly. But at this point, it was pretty well established. Most men voted along party lines, and it was men voting at this point. Women did not vote. Not all men voted. But most men who did vote voted upon party lines on the intertwined issues of slavery and Texas annexation, which is a larger issue. Texas annexation can be expanded into a kind of martial imperial expansion, north as well as south. In the 1844 election, a slim majority determined that America would be for both, right? That America was voting in Polk because Polk was the guy who was going to both expand more than any other president had territorially, and also ensure the continuance of slavery for the practice of slavery for a bit into the future. Now, not everyone thought that the war was good or just. Among those against it was then Second Lieutenant Ulysses S. Grant, who would later become president, as we'll see. He later called the war one of the most unjust ever waged, claiming that America did not consider justice in their desire to acquire additional territory. Right, and this is another quote from a similar time period later, looking back. I do not think there was ever a more wicked war than that waged by the United States on Mexico. I thought so at the time, when I was a youngster, only I had not moral courage enough to resign. That's it. That strikes me as a really courageous admission, right? Grant claims that America did not consider justice in their desire to acquire additional territory, and it's pretty clear that he was right, that whether or not you want to go in on wicked or, even so far as unjust, both of which, again, are mythic categories, right? Justice wasn't considered. It wasn't part of what motivated Americans to wage war upon Mexico. Fighting ended when American troops captured Mexico City in September of 1847. This image, the larger image, is of that battle, and just a side note on an aspect of this battle that continues into the living mythos of America today. What you see on the bottom right are Marines in dress, and you see that many of them, those who rate it in terms of rank, have the red stripe down the pant leg, which is known as the blood stripe. And for Marines, and most active duty or veteran Marines will tell you that you ask them where this blood stripe comes from, and they will tell you from the Battle of Chapultepec, which is a battle in this conquering of taking of Mexico City, where, according to the standard mythos, an enormous percentage of the Marines who battled there died, and so this blood stripe was gained from there. In fact, the Marines had added this red stripe to their pant legs 10 years before then, because mostly in the much more pragmatic but much less exciting version of the story, which happens to be historically or factually true, the red stripe made it easy to identify people on a very confused battlefield, right? So it's like having team jerseys in the same function, right? But it lives as an aspect of the myth of the United States Marine Corps, which has a wealth of mythology, a very active and strong and continuing set of living myths. That stripe came from the Battle of Chapultepec, which we see pictured here. And it's through this battle that really, and the taking of Mexico City, that really the war was ended. February of 1848 saw the Treaty of Guadalupe, which actually officially ended the war. And America did buy California from Mexico for about 11 cents an acre. Also Nevada, Utah, parts of Arizona, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Colorado, and Wyoming, and the disputed borderland that is now mostly part of Texas. In this war, through this treaty, Mexico ceded 55% of its territory, and the Rio Grande became the borderline, which the Anglo-Americans had been arguing for. So as we turn to De la Guerra and the popular ballads of Joaquin Murrieta and Gregorio Cortez, we'll note the articles of this treaty that came into greatest controversy through their betrayal. So what we see here is from Article 8, in the said territories, property of every kind, now belonging to Mexicans not established there, shall be inviolably respected. The present owners, the heirs of these, and all Mexicans who may hereafter acquire said property by contract shall enjoy with respect to it guarantees equally ample as if the same belonged to citizens of the United States. Much of this treaty, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, was meant to protect the human rights and land rights of the Mexican nationals who already resided in this territory. The treaty as signed stipulated protection for the property and civil rights of Mexican nationals living within the new borders. Mexican nationals' land grants were to be protected, right? Those living in the new U.S. territories weren't to be robbed of their lands. They lived there, the war was fought, the war was won, the treaty was signed, but that doesn't mean you get to take the land away from the inhabitants, is what this treaty in article after article spelled out. The U.S. Senate refused to ratify the treaty as signed, and the bottom right is the original treaty, which remains in keeping. So it just reduced Article 9, protecting civil rights. It completely deleted Article 10, protecting land grants. It mostly disregarded Article 8, which we see here. So what had not been won through war and treaty was simply taken bureaucratically at this point. What the dominant U.S. forces did not win with the sword, they took with the pen. And this reminds me of Woody Guthrie, whom we will turn to at some point. Some will rob you with a 6-gun and some with a fountain pen. 6-guns were in fact invented right around this time in 1836. This was the first war they were really used in. Here, what wasn't robbed with a gun was robbed with a fountain pen. Now, to this day, Hispanic American civil rights, Latinx rights in America, the movement is rooted in the Mexican-American War and in the federal government's betrayal of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and we can sort of see why at this point. The treaty was in large part meant to protect people living on the ceded lands from westward expansionists, pioneers, those living into and claiming what they believed to be their manifest destiny, Anglo-Americans. The gold rush threw that treaty and all of those agreements to the wind. As it turns out, having already in large part denied and destroyed the inalienable rights of Native Americans, Anglo-Americans, who were called that because they spoke English, now proceeded to do the same to the overlapping group of Hispanic Americans. 1851's land law required all Latinos living in what were called the new territories to provide proof of their land grants. This is the circumstance that De la Guerra rails against, right? So in 1851, so 1848, the treaty is signed. 1851, a law is passed that says, sure, you can keep your land grant, but I need to see documentation. I need to see the original deeds. I need to see the paperwork. And, this was the mid-19th century. That paperwork didn't work that way. Some of these land grants were generationally established. The paperwork was no longer in the hands of the folks who lived there. And because of the way that land grants were being adjudicated, this is what De la Guerra rails against. So here he is. He was an extraordinary, on the left, the big picture, an extraordinarily rare figure, a Mexican American in the California State Assembly and Senate during the 1850s, when land was being stolen in mass amounts in contravention of the treaty and from Mexican Americans. He comes from a family, the De la Guerra family were themselves Spanish aristocrats generations back, and so the map on the upper right shows you in grayed out version like how much land just in these counties. There was also some in the Bay Area. The De la Guerra family stood to lose by the new land law. So it was in like every heroic figure that we have or will look at, personal motivations were intertwined with political ones. But De la Guerra remained a dedicated and stalwart defender of the rights of all of the Mexican Americans. He argued for the poor, the least among them. He argues at one point that of the 113 members of this legislature, I am the only native of this state, right? And that the native population therefore depended on his voice, which they did. And most were not aristocratic. Most were relatively of a relatively modest means, if not poor, but had land which they worked and survived on. They did depend on his voice. He worked tirelessly, he argued heroically, and then he died. And in any appreciable terms, his cause and that of those he lobbied for died with him. And it remained interred for over 100 years. In our excerpt, as we're told in the brief intro, De la Guerra attacked the practices by which land rights were adjudicated under U.S. and California law. And we might note somewhat sadly that in the brief excerpt that we read, he refers to self-determination and to work as privileges, right? The privilege to work, the privilege to chop your own firewood, right? That this was being denied to folks. And the difference between privileges and rights has long in America been drawn on lines not only of inherent universal human value, but also on racial and ethnic determinants. So this is one more moment where we see work itself as a privilege, right? But he also used biblical language, the biblical language of the conquerors, to attempt to convince them of a more moral response, right, according to their own principles. Foreigners in their own land, strangers in their own land. This is what he refers to the Mexican Americans as, right? And this is a biblical phrase used to refer to the Hebrews wandering in the desert. And we might here note a correlation, and this is where I have Ta-Nehisi Coates at the bottom. His famed article from the summer of 2014, published in The Atlantic and making the case for reparations, not the same issue, similar, we could certainly draw connections, but he opens that article with a lengthy citation from Deuteronomy, which calls the Hebrews to release slaves and to grant them liberal furnishings in doing it, right? That was part of the moral inheritance of all who lived under a biblical mandate. The argument in both instances is rooted in justice, as understood by the Bible, that granted the Anglo-Americans a sense of divine approbation, right? So the effect in both instances has been negligible, at best, with the will to power and the greed for resources outweighing a really strong shared cultural commitment to the ideals of justice so freely proclaimed. And again, what I highlight here is not the inherent rightness of one or another mythic stance, but the hypocrisy of claiming a sense of value and purpose while at the same time acting directly against that sense of value and purpose. So the ballads, moving on, the ballads or the corridos are in large part a response to this, right? A popular form since the Mexican War of Independence in 1810. These ballads often address the injustices of political and physical oppression, and they celebrate the heroes who act against such oppression. They're story songs, oral traditions that spread news and celebrate heroes and crystallize values. And Joaquin Murrieta is something of a Robin Hood figure. We'll turn to him in just a second, but I want to show you that there are. This is a tradition that is rooted in the Mexican War for Independence 1810, but it's a contemporary. It remains a contemporary form, and it's been revitalized in certain ways in the recent decades. The bottom two images show bands whom you can look up, and I've posted one from the bottom left, the Mexican Standoff, that I encourage you to take a look at. It is a living form, right? Joaquin Murrieta, whom we read the ballad of, and whom I've also posted a ballad of, is something of a Robin Hood figure who himself inspired the figure of Zorro, interestingly enough, stealing from the rich and giving to the poor. And we see in this ballad what is a persistent theme, right? This has become a classic one. The recognition that there is a great yawning gap between law and justice. Read these, listen to them, consider other ones you might know. If there's one, feel free to send me links to ones you might know that you'd recommend. There's a film listed on our film list under the review assignment that I encourage you to watch, which is The Ballad of Gregorio Cortez. It's an older film. Production value is not super, super high, but it tells a story in narrative dramatic form. As much as possible as we move through this history, really, I encourage you to keep a connection to the popular forms through which these stories are told. History is kept alive, interpreted, and reshaped by these popular forms. They are the most direct manifestation of living myths. They're the forms through which a people keeps its myths alive, far more widely accessed, far more influential than history books or college classes. The popular forms keep the active living myths current, right? And so again, I encourage you to take a look at the YouTube video from the Mexican standoff. So we'll close by turning to a couple examples of living myths, to a couple poems, neither of which come from the Mexican-American tradition, neither of which focus on the Latinx experience, both of which speak to and articulate the mythos of manifest destiny that we see invented really during this war era. The first one comes from a decidedly Anglo-American perspective. Robert Frost, who lived from 1874 to 1963, is a pillar of the Anglo-American poetic establishment. His style is plain-spoken, simple, accessible, and his fame and influence is largely attributable to the persona of the common man, the everyman, the man on the street, the farmer, right? He wrote some really excellent poems. I've enjoyed Robert Frost and some pretty great essays, and I don't mean here in what follows to execute a takedown piece, right? That's not what I'm trying to do. But the voice he writes through often now offers us more than anything a vision on the unthinkingly colonialist or imperialistic perspective, the perspective that tacitly forgives or justifies genocide and racism by celebrating its more romanticizable effects. He was in this way a product of his time and of his privilege, and not always on the right side of history. And that's the poem we're looking at. The Gift Outright is in some ways the best example of this, or a really excellent example of it. Written in the late 30s, early 40s, it was famously recited at John F. Kennedy's presidential inauguration, sort of by accident. The poem that Frost intended to read was called Dedication, and that I've posted to our website, and he couldn't read it because the sun was in his eyes. The glare was too much, so he recited from memory The Gift Outright, which JFK had also asked for that or another of his choosing. So we'll see later that JFK ran on a platform celebrating what he called the New Frontier. Housing, technology, a 20th century version of progress. So Frost's poem, The Gift Outright, a poem romanticizing that old frontier, seemed a fitting choice. That poem reads, "The land was ours before we were the land's." The poem elides completely those whose land it actually was, before many deeds of war made it a land reflecting the aspirations and accomplishments of Anglo-Americans and their sense of progress. We read it here because it reflects the dominant American understanding of frontier expansionism. From the time of the Mexican-American War easily through the inauguration of Kennedy, and for many up to and including today. It's manifest destiny in iambic pentameter and pretty short. So less reflective of the dominant Anglo-American perspective is Langston Hughes, and his poem, Let America Be America Again, which is pretty amazing. Hughes, 1902 to 1967, is a rough contemporary of Frost, and this poem is similarly a backward-looking reflection on history as it had developed, right? So Hughes was a central figure in the Harlem Renaissance. Many of you have already met him, which was itself a 1920s movement dedicated to the arts and political consciousness of Black Americans and really centralized in Harlem. Worth looking into, some great poets. I'm a big fan of Countee Cullen. If you're looking for another one. This poem, though, takes as its central unifying focus a multi-ethnic, multiracial, multicultural figure, a kind of a kaleidoscopic figure of the oppressed, the people whose dedication to the American dream did not translate into an inheritance of that dream. It's a poem that juxtaposes. It doesn't quite balance. It refuses to easily balance. On the one hand, the optimism of an ideal, right? Let America be the dream the dreamers dreamed. Let it be that great, strong land of love where never kings connive nor tyrants scheme, that any man be crushed by one above. Right? That's an incredible optimism. An optimism, an idealism, an articulation of the American dream that's entirely positive. It balances that against or with the reality of the disenfranchised, dispossessed, oppressed, right? It never was America to me. And we hear that refrain repeated. There's no diminishment here of the glory or the wonder of a dream so strong, so brave, so true. That dream isn't diminished even by the pervasive experience of finding only the same old stupid plan of dog eat dog, of mighty crush the weak. That same old stupid plan of dog eat dog and mighty crush the weak is something that we will continue to see throughout the rest of this semester. It's a dream that in this poem is almost dead today, which is as compelling in our own time as it was in the time of Hughes, but it's only almost dead, right? For the voice of the poet. Oh yes, I say it plain, America never was America to me, and yet I swear this oath, America will be. That's the turn, right? The turn, it turns on this insistence that the steel of freedom does not stain, that somehow these ideals cannot be tarnished by that same old stupid plan and those who project it upon a disempowered, disenfranchised populace. The steel of freedom does not stain, and it's we, the people, who must redeem the land, the mines, the plants, the rivers, the mountains, and the endless plain. All the stretch of these great green states, and make America again. I'll leave you with that. Next time we will turn to the Civil War.